Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Mixtape with Scott, where we dive into the personal stories of economists, scientists, and authors. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham, and I'm thrilled to have you with us today. In this episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing the talented John Roth, an inspiring young econometrician and assistant professor at Brown University. John's work on difference and differences has been making waves in the field of econometrics and throughout the applied community. And I was eager to learn more about his life journey and the experiences that got him to where he is today. We covered a lot of topics, wide range of things from growing up in Massachusetts and his love for sports and math as a kid, finding his way through graduate school, selecting his fields as he moved into the job market, and even the sociology of the applied empirical community versus the econometricians. And so John shared also a lot of valuable advice about doing what you love and following your passions over trying to predict what you think the market is going to want. And for those of you interested in learning more about John's work, he's going to be hosting a workshop on advanced difference and differences on Friday, April 21st. Just Google Mixtape Sessions, an online platform for really talented, smart people to teach people over Zoom econometric methodologies that help sort of run. So if you want to find more information about the workshop, learn about any discounts that are available for students, as well as anybody facing various liquidity constraints and people from developing countries, just go to the website, shoot me an email, and I can talk to you about it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the incredible John Roth. Just sit back, relax, enjoy this casual conversation we had. And as always, please share, like, and subscribe to the Mixtape with Scott so you don't miss any of our amazing guests. Thanks for tuning in. Well, it is a pleasure to have on the podcast a person I've gotten to know a little bit the last couple of years online, John Roth. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Of course, pleasure's mine. Great to be here.
Can you start off, and for the sake of the listener, tell us your name and your job title and who your boss is?
I'm John Roth. I'm an assistant professor at Brown. The department chair is John Friedman, so I guess he's my boss.
Who's your boss?
Yeah, I do some workshops for Scott, so I guess you're my boss a little bit too. But
yeah, right. He does payroll though. I don't do that. So okay, so I have a little icebreaker. So if you could describe yourself in 3 words, actually we do it this way. If you could describe, if I was to talk to, yeah, we'll do it this way. So if you describe yourself in 3 words, what would they be, and why would you say that?
Ooh, 3 words. You're like AR Insights editor, but like even stricter. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna do 4 words.
All right.
But I'm gonna do nerd who's kind of cool.
Nerd is kind of cool. Cool. Very good. All right. Well, why would you say that?
I don't know. I feel like, like I'm like a huge nerd. Like I love talking about econometrics or like sports and stuff. But then like also like my wife always gives me crap that I was a fraternity brother in college, and like I feel like she's like a straight nerd and was like, oh, like you were like so cool, like you went to all these parties, like you were always drunk, like I'm like really into sports. Like I feel like I'm like a huge nerd, but I can also be one of the guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I did not expect to just like start talking about being a fraternity brother in college. That was not where I thought this was gonna go like immediately, but yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, which fraternity were you in?
I was in Sigma Alpha Mu, often called Sammy.
Yeah. I don't know that one. Okay, that was at Penn.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, here we go. All right, so let's go back to when you were a kid. So tell me about your childhood. Where'd you grow up? What'd your parents do for a living?
I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, so outside of Boston. My dad worked in speech recognition, so
Hmm.
Like he worked on the original Siri product, and before that on Dragon Naturally Speaking. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's like a
Yeah,
desktop dictation software.
that was a long time ago.
Um,
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that was in grad school. It was like you would talk into it. It would do all your dad worked on that.
yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, he was one of the founders of Dragon, and he like he worked at what was Voice Signal and is now Nuance, which at the beginning did Siri. Apple subsequently took it over. Um,
Wow.
so yeah, that's pretty cool.
It's very
And
cool.
my mom raised me and my two brothers, so she was also working pretty hard.
Yeah. Oh, so that company was in Massachusetts. Where'd you say it was?
Yeah, so I grew up in Newton. It was for a time in Newton, and in other kind of moved to other suburbs of the Boston area.
Oh, okay. Okay. Was he a faculty somewhere or was he was just in private industry?
No, he was in private industry. So he did a PhD in physics, and then did a couple of postdocs, and then the job market for theoretical physicists is, if you're not like Albert Einstein, is not great. So he was like an MIT undergrad. So he came back to Boston, like went to the MIT career office and was like, I need a job, and somehow got hooked up with um, some people who are in the very early stage of developing speech recognition, and they were like, you seem smart, like we can teach you how to write some computer code and like do this stuff. So
That's super cool. That's super cool. I wouldn't expect you to tell me that. Well, so how do you think that environment with your mom and your dad and your siblings growing up, around that kind of cool, innovative stuff, how do you think that shaped your interests and kind of your values?
good question. I mean, so I guess while we're on the topic of my dad, I guess, I always felt like my dad was smarter than me, like, smarter than everyone. Who could be smarter than my dad? And so the fact that he couldn't make it in academia doing theory, like, always kind of left me with this, like, I'm going to do something practical. And so I've been like slowly kind of giving up on stages of that. So it was like, oh, like I don't want to be an academic, like that's too hard a life to make it, and like I want to do something useful, and like there's no way, if my dad couldn't do it, there's no way I'm smart enough. And then it was like I kind of got into research and it was cool. And I was like, all right, but I'm going to do like applied, like, labor econ research that has like actual, like real world applications. I'm not going to do theory like my dad. And then like I kind of got into econometrics.
Yeah.
And so it's like every the step of the way, I've been a little bit like, wait, is this really what I'm doing with my life? But
Right, right,
it's kind
right.
of been the road I've gone down. So it's
Yeah.
working out all right so far, I
That's
guess.
awesome. That's so cool. Yeah. So I mean, he kind of like so it sounds like he's a big figure in your life. That sounds right.
Yeah, for sure. Both my parents are.
So are you related to Al Roth? I heard that.
I am. Al is my first cousin twice removed.
Oh yeah, how does
So
that work? I never
for
figured
those
out
who
how
don't
that works.
have, yeah, PhDs in genealogy. So Al is on paper is first cousins with my grandfather. So his
First
father
cousins with your
his
grandfather.
father and my grandfather's father were brothers. But
Oh,
he's
okay.
like, it's like one of those like weird deals where he's, I think, almost exactly the same age as my dad, but
Mm,
he like, skipped a generation. So
got it.
he's technically on the level of my grandfather.
I see. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So y'all have like is your family is your extended family pretty close? Is it pretty big? Y'all, I mean, like you knew him kind of growing up?
So Al, I kind of knew because he was at Harvard for a lot of the time that I was, you know, growing up in the Boston area, and his son Ben and I are exactly the same age.
Mm,
Um, and so, like, there are other people of the same distance from me in the family tree who I've like never met. But
mm.
Al, I sort of knew growing up, but I can't say we were super close. It was like, once or twice a year, like our families would get together, we'd have dinner, we'd play ping pong in the basement. So, like, for most of my life until I became like an adult academic economist, like, I thought of Al as like, you know, this like guy who's cousins with my dad who happens to be very good at ping pong. Right. It wasn't really until he won the Nobel Prize when I was like in undergrad at the time that I realized that he was like professionally a big deal.
Right. You're like, and he's good, and he won a Nobel Prize. He's really good at ping pong, and he won the Nobel Prize. That's great. Well, so growing up in Massachusetts, what kind of stuff did you like to do as a kid and in high school?
uh, it was pretty much all sports all the time.
Yeah.
Um, like, you know, so in high school I played basketball, tennis, and I ran cross country.
Mm.
And like, I played touch football all the time with friends growing up. Like
Mm.
just basically any sport I could play. I love playing pretty much.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was pretty much my life as a kid. I mean, I obviously, did reasonably well in school and like
Right.
did homework and stuff, but
Yeah.
like, yeah, I watched a lot of sports and played a lot of sports, I guess
Yeah.
would be the short version of my
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
childhood.
What was
Yeah.
your best sport?
In terms of playing or watching or
Yeah, that you were good at, or that you
that I was
liked.
good at.
What was your favorite sport, and what was your? I guess it's probably the same thing. What was your favorite sport, and What were you particularly felt like you were good at?
So as a kid, like as a young kid, I was really good at soccer. I was a really good goalie. Um, and that was really fun until I got older. So like youth soccer, the field is small, the goals are small, and the
Uh-huh.
players aren't that good. So the goalies get a lot of shots. So there's like a lot you can
Oh,
do.
yeah.
And then as you get older, the field gets bigger, the nets get bigger, and the defenders get better. And
Uh,
so just the fraction of shots that you can, one that you get on goal, but two that you can save just decreases very rapidly as you age as a
mm,
soccer player. And
mm,
so I loved being a goalie in youth soccer until I was like, 13 or 14 years old, because
mm.
there was just like a lot of activity that you could do.
Right.
But then as I got older, you just start getting fewer shots on net. And then of the shots you get, the goal is bigger, the shots are bigger. So like there's just a substantial fraction of the shots on net that you just have no chance. And
Uh,
so kind of the amount of activity that you can like actually, have some value added in, I found went down a lot, like as I got to high school.
you
And
could
so I
tell,
like,
you could see it happening. It's like a pretty
yeah,
sharp thing.
yeah. Well, I don't know. It was maybe not completely sharp, but it would like went from a point where I like loved playing goalie to where I
Mm.
was just getting like a little bit bored of it.
Uh,
So like as a kid, I played a ton of soccer and was like a good goalie. And then I got kind of tired of it. And then like in high school, I got more into basketball.
mm,
So in high school, I I played like I had not played a lot of basketball as a kid. So I like started playing a lot of pickup with friends. And then like by my senior year, like I made the varsity team at my high school
yeah.
in basketball. And then mainly rode the bench for the entire year. But I played a lot of basketball with friends and in practice and stuff
Yeah.
throughout high
Yeah.
school.
Yeah. Well, so were there any like people when you were in high school that like had one of those big influences on your academic interests, like role models or mentors or anything like that?
I don't know. I mean, I had a math teacher who was really awesome in high school. Ms. Seidel was her name.
Hmm.
I guess I mean, so for most of school, I was super bored in math. I hated math because I thought it was really boring. And like, from my perspective, like, we'd like in fourth grade, we would mainly just review all the stuff we did at third grade. And then there would be like a little bit new material at the end. And then like in fifth grade, we would basically review the stuff we did in fourth grade, which is a review of third grade. Like, I just thought it was very slow for me. And
Yeah.
so I didn't really like math a lot growing up.
Yeah.
And then I felt in high school, I had a few teachers like this teacher, Miss Seidel, the most prominent of which, that made math more interesting because they actually made it a little bit challenging.
Yeah.
So I feel like I started getting more into math in high school, which obviously kind of led down the path of being an econometrician. But certainly at the time, it didn't feel like it was, like transformational, like this is what I want to do all the time. It was kind of like, oh, like that's not as boring as I thought it would be.
Yeah.
But that might just be me as like a snarky teenager was like not, gonna
Yeah.
get all excited. Oh, this is really going to change my life. Like that was not really,
Well, were you,
kind of the
did
mindset.
anything happen in high school where you would have like heard? I mean, you got your cousin that's going to win the Nobel Prize in economics, but were you like beyond that kind of just halo of economics in the family? Was there things that you were thinking that I like economics, or you knew much anything substantive about it in high school?
Not really. I mean, as I said, like Al was like more of a ping pong partner than someone I really knew anything about econ about. And I didn't like I went to a relatively small Jewish high school. Like we didn't have an econ AP or like anything like that in high school. So I knew like almost nothing about econ
Mm,
as a field, like until I got to Penn.
yeah,
I guess I was always good at math. Like I liked quantitative stuff, even if I thought the classes were boring. And then I also really liked, social sciences. So like I really liked
mm,
history. Like I was on the mock trial team in high school. Like I liked that like lawyerly type of stuff. So, I kind of vaguely knew that econ had some mix of like social science with math type of
right,
stuff. And so it was
right,
something that interested me as I was approaching college. But
yeah.
I think I basically knew nothing about it, you know, as a high schooler.
Yeah. So you go to Penn. So you get to Penn, and what are you immediately thinking, as you get there, like both like socially and also academically? Like you have in mind like a plan of like what you want your major to be pretty quickly?
Not really when I got there. Like, as I said, I did mock trial in high school. So I thought, oh, maybe like I want to be a lawyer.
Right.
Um, but then I also sort of knew I liked quantitative stuff. So I took some econ classes early on, but I would say it wasn't like I knew right away that like that's what I wanted to do. But I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
by like my sophomore year, like I'd take an intro to micro and macro and stuff, and I liked that it had that mix of quantitative and social stuff.
yeah.
Um, and I was reasonably good at it. So like I think by my beginning of my sophomore year, I sort of had the idea that that's what I wanted to major in.
Oh, econ.
Um, but
Because you double major, but you were thinking econ is the one you start thinking about.
yeah, so math I did a little bit later, like uh Ufuk Oxygen, who's at Chicago now, but he was at Penn. Um, who's a macroeconomist. He taught me like intermediate macro as a sophomore.
Mm,
And I did well in his class, and I was talking to him, and I was like, I'm interested in econ. And he was like, you should definitely think about getting a PhD, which to be honest, at the time, I didn't really know so much what that involved.
yeah.
But he was like, if you want to get a PhD, you should take some more like higher level math classes. And so I started, taking real analysis and stuff like that. And I kind of liked that. And I'd taken a lot of the classes already. So I added that as a second major,
Yeah.
I think a little bit later on.
Yeah. Like obviously you're a really smart person, but there's lots of smart people that don't find that math like comes naturally to them. But it seems like you're both kind of like really smart, but math has always felt like kind of like you really enjoy it. Well, what's your personality that would made math so easy for you, or made it something you really enjoyed for such a long part of your life?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not sure I would say I enjoyed it for a long part of my life. Like it always came naturally to me, but I guess most of school, I found it really boring because it just felt like it was the same thing over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it wasn't really until like late in college late in high school or in college where it started to become more challenging. And like I felt like I started making progress,
Yeah.
that it was something that I came to really like. Um, but I do think I don't know. I mean, I guess it's hard for me to say what it is I like about it. It's a good question. I don't know. I guess now I kind of like you know there's like this people talk about warm glow, right? Like what gives you warm glow from an activity, and I kind of like you set up some problem and you're a little bit confused, and then you make some progress, or you like think of some different angle, and that gets you to the answer. And just like the process of you want to prove something or derive something and you aren't really sure, and then you think of some angle, and then you can just kind of see things working out along that angle, and you get to the answer, like just kind of gives me that warm glow. And I guess I don't
It's not
know, you know
connected. it's not connected with your love of sports in any way, is it? Are those two things like, is there something about, that kind of like strategic approach to solving a problem and your how you think deeply about sports? Those aren't the same parts of the brain, is it? For you?
No, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's like, I get a warm glow from solving a math problem or like hitting a three-pointer in someone's face, but it's like they're just like, they seem just like completely different spheres and parts of the brain. I,
Yeah.
I was definitely not one of those like sports nerds that was like, I got really into math because I was like calculating like baseball value added on the
Right.
slide rule. Like there is that like type of nerd that like gets into math because they want to do it for sports, and
Yeah.
that was like very much not me.
Mm,
So yeah, I'm not sure I see like an
yeah.
obvious link between
Right.
the two of them
Right.
besides that like I like doing it.
Yeah. So this guy that sends up the macroeconomist, he makes a big impression on you. Is there anybody else? Do you end up taking any econometrics while you're at Penn that has that same kind of like, hey, I kind of like this?
I did take a bunch of econometrics at Penn. So it's funny. We had Ario DePaula here for a seminar a couple of weeks ago, and he taught me like the first econometrics class at Penn. So that was kind of cool
That is cool.
to have him out.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, he actually remembered who I was, which is good. uh, but but yeah, so I took that. I took a bunch of classes in the stats department too. And then I did take like I took the first of the grad econometrics classes when I was a
Mm,
senior.
mm,
That was like kind of a crazy story. So by my junior year, I kind of knew or I thought I knew I wanted to do a PhD in econ. Um, Again, at the time, I still don't think I was quite sure what a PhD in econ entailed. Like, I don't think like I would not advise people to follow the path that I followed into a PhD in econ, which was just like I kind of liked econ and I was like, all right, I'll keep on doing it. But
yeah.
I think I like didn't really realize like what the PhD involved and what it's preparing you for. But
Right.
I had set it in my mind that this was a thing that I was going to do as a junior,
Yeah.
and so I took the math camp that Penn has like for
Mm.
the PhD students as like the summer after my junior year.
Oh, after your junior year.
So like before I was a senior,
Oh.
and I was actually planning to take the grad micro class as a
Mm,
senior, but I took the math camp and I did well in the math camp, and they had like this prize for the people who had the top two scores in the math camp. They gave them Hayashi's econometrics textbook.
uh-huh.
Uh, and so I won this econometrics textbook
Yeah.
in the summer before my senior year.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I have the textbook.
Yeah.
So I might as well not buy another textbook and just take econometrics. And so I took grad econometrics with Shu Chang and Frank Shorefida,
Uh-huh.
basically entirely like I was a complier based on textbooks basically, like if they'd given me the macro textbook, like I might have taken the macro class, like I might not be on this podcast. I can't say that that grad econometrics class like convinced me that I wanted to do econometrics. Like that took
Uh,
me and not like there was a whole nother path of like, because again, like my dad was a theorist. Like
right.
clearly, I'm not smart enough to be a theorist. Like that was definitely still the attitude at the time.
Right.
So like there was another couple years of like me thinking I was going to be like an applied micro, like labor
Mm,
type of person.
yeah.
But definitely that foundation like sort of set me up as like, econometrics is interesting. Like it's something I'm pretty good at,
Mm,
such that like as my interest started getting more and more econometricsy, that background was definitely important.
yeah. Yeah. What were your teachers saying to you while you were still kind of like continuing to do better and better in econometrics and all of these advanced econ classes? What kind of feedback were you starting to get from them?
So people have definitely told me I should go to grad school. And then like I thought I was going to go to grad school. Um, so I was originally planning to just like apply my senior year and go straight. And then um, all of my or most of my friends at Penn is like a very pre-professional place because
Mm,
it has, Wharton undergrad is like
yeah.
a business school, and that
Right.
just kind of has spillovers onto everyone else. So there's like the modal pen undergrad is like, interviewing for like either like McKinsey, BCG, and Bain consulting
Okay.
types of jobs, or like, Goldman Sachs type of, investment banking jobs.
Right.
And so, I got to my senior year and all my friends were doing all these interviews, and I like kind of had it in my mind that I was going to go to grad school. But again, at the time, like, I don't think I really appreciated that like econ grad school is like preparation for being like a full-time econ researcher. And like I hadn't done that much research. I
Yeah.
just like taken a lot of classes and like liked taking classes. And so I like kind of had this freak out my senior year of like, am I really signing myself up for 5 or 6 more years of school that I don't really know what I'm doing? And I don't really know, like I've been in school basically my entire life and I've never really done anything else.
Yeah.
And so I like had like a kind of freak out of like, is this really what I'm doing? And so um I didn't apply to grad school my senior year, and I worked for a year at Cornerstone Research, which does
Yeah.
economics consulting.
Hmm.
And so my path to research was basically, or my path to graduate school was like, I started at Cornerstone Research. I really didn't like it. I
Yeah.
like applied to grad school like 3 months in. I was like, all right, I've seen the outside world. Like, I've had enough of this outside corporate world. Like, bring me back to school.
So you worked there for like a year?
I worked there for a year. So
Yeah.
I started there in like, I don't know, July or August.
Yeah.
Like I had to apply to grad school in like, what is it, November, December.
Right. Right.
So by like 3 or 4 months in, I was like, get me out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I applied to grad school, and then I was like, you know, well, I had to wait to hear from grad school. But then like once I got into grad school in like January, February, I was like kind of a lame duck there for like a year.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you go to Harvard, so like I don't know what it would be like, but what did it feel like when you're stepping in there? It's like, one of the best programs in the world and in history, and it's super famous. And what did it feel like when you were like a brand new first year student going there?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess that it felt like there was a lot of uncertainty because like I'd always been one of the best students,
Mm,
right? So like, in middle school, elementary school, high school, college, I was like always like, towards the top. And then it was like, but okay, like, everyone else here was also basically in that
yeah.
shoes. And so just kind of like, I think it was the first time, maybe I had a little bit of this in undergrad, but like trying to figure out, like a little bit like, you know, rookie getting to the major leagues type of thing. Like every rookie
Hmm.
getting to the major leagues was like a star in like every other level
Right.
that they'd ever played. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
there
Yeah.
definitely was a bit of that of just like figuring out like, who am I as an economist? Like, am I any good at this stuff?
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
I think certainly like, you know, until you get to your like fourth or fifth year, you're like, at least I was not particularly good at doing research. And so like there was a lot of figuring out of like, can I do this research thing?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I guess the one other thing I would say, I guess, about getting to Harvard is, so as I mentioned, like I did not have a lot of research experience. And like I would even say like I didn't even really like know that a PhD, like the purpose of the PhD was doing research at like the exclusion of like pretty much anything else.
Right.
Like so I mean at Penn I had like amazing coursework. Like, they gave us an econ model. They were like, solve the model. Here's the intuition for the model. Like I felt like I really understood theory well.
Yeah.
Like, micro theory, macro theory, metrics theory. Like if you said like find the Nash equilibrium of this game, I knew how to find the Nash equilibrium of the game. If you said like show this estimator is consistent, efficient, whatever,
Right.
like I had the technical tools really
Yeah.
well.
Right.
But for whatever reason, like I just, maybe it's the culture of the place, maybe it's just me. I was just like not super involved in research there.
Mm.
I worked a little bit as a research assistant one summer for like a sociology professor. Like I
Huh.
did a little bit of data work for UFUC, but not a whole lot. And I was just like not very involved in research. To be honest, like there was an option of writing a senior thesis. And, I asked the professor there, should I write a senior thesis, or like would it be better to, like take grad econometrics as a senior? And this person said to me, well, like usually our undergrad theses are not particularly good, so like take the class.
Yeah.
Like, and so I sort of just had this view of like, econ is something you like learn in classes and you solve a bunch of problems. And like, I'm just going to get to grad school. I'm going to learn how to solve the problems like even better. And then like
Mhm.
eventually I'm going to figure out like what I do research. And like, I wasn't completely unaware that you had to write a thesis, but it just like, I kind of came in with this impression that like, I don't know enough theory to do research yet. Like I'm going to have to learn 2 more years of theory and then like I'll work on research. And so
Yeah.
it was a little bit of a culture shock. Like I arrived there on day one and people were like, what do you want to do research in? And I was like, I have no idea like what I want to do,
I want to
right?
do research in
Like,
problem sets.
like, yeah, exactly. Like I came here to solve some problem sets. Like I thought for the next 2 years, like I'm just going to be solving some problem sets. Like that's what I know how to do. And I like solving econ problem sets.
Right.
I find it interesting.
Right.
But it was, so I think that actually the biggest culture shock of arriving in Harvard was there were a lot of people there that had, worked for, or say like Roth for 2 years, or like, for whatever reason had like more exposure to research. And so they came in with this like, the literature on the returns to schooling has said like X, Y, and Z, but they've never studied it in this new context. Or like, I have this idea for this new instrumental variable for this cool thing. And that was like very much like outside of the realm of things that I was like thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, like I would even go to the extreme to say that like, I think the number of empirical econ papers I had read at undergrad, I could count on like one hand.
Yeah.
Right. So like I solved a lot of theory models. I like solving the theory. Maybe someone in a slide would have like a table of like, here are some results that like suggest, this theory is good or it fits the
Right.
data or something.
Yeah.
But in terms of like, you know, empirical papers, having like actually opened up a paper, I think the number of papers that I did was like, you know, could have been two, like
Yeah.
I just had basically not seen like, the types of like method stuff that I work on now, like,
Yeah.
difference and differences. Like, I'm not sure I'd read a difference and differences paper,
Right.
like in undergrad.
Yeah.
Like I
Yeah. Yeah.
showed up at Harvard and there were these kids who were like, oh, like I'm thinking of running this diff and diff or this like IV. And I like, I could like tell you the theory of like the exclusion restriction and like if you have a valid IV, like here's the like GMM you got to run. But
Right.
I was like that whole world of like I have these empirical ideas, like
Right.
you know these are the types of like like mostly harmless tool set like types of papers. That was like all very new to me when I got to Harvard.
Well, so when does it change? What happens the switch where you go from being a problem set guy to being a a researcher?
Yeah. So um I mean I guess it's started to switch right away, but I guess like so I guess so something that was influential for me was so the um during the year that I was um at Cornerstone,
Yeah.
wasting away at my my desk job at Cornerstone, I somehow I don't know how this happened. I came across the Dale and Kruger paper on returns to elite colleges.
Yeah.
And I'd gone to Penn, Ivy League school, and I just, I'd been indoctrinated with this view that, of course, there are these massive returns for getting into an elite college.
Right.
And so somehow a friend and I came across this Dale and Kruger paper that basically suggests that like it's all selection. That if you look at kids that got into the same sets of colleges, but one of them went to Penn, the other one went to Penn State, but there's like basically no difference in their earnings.
Mm.
And I sort of, I came in with this almost degenerate prior that
Right.
like this thing was like could not possibly be true.
Right.
And so I like wanted to like I got interested in labor economics because I like wanted to like play
Ah,
around with this data and prove that it was wrong. I think at some point, actually, my friend and I like sent an email to Alan Kruger. He was like still alive at the time, and it was like, "Can you send us this data?" And he was like, "No, it's like under a DUA, but like if you'd like to, respond, if you like to use it, you can like apply for the DUA,
right.
at this and this link." And like I give Alan Kruger a lot of credit for responding. Like I was like a nobody like emailing Alan Kruger at that point in time. But so that paper kind of got me interested in like labor econ types of questions, like
Yeah.
returns to schooling types of things. And so I started reading a little bit more of like those types of papers. And so I guess
Mhm.
that kind of got me into labor econ. And so like by the summer after my first year in grad school, I worked for Larry Katz.
Mm.
And I was like kind of interested in like education type of stuff. So like
Mhm.
I have this working paper that probably I will never publish, but on Scott Walker's union reform in Wisconsin, Act
Yeah.
10, and like what that does to teacher labor supply. So I had these results that um, there are a lot of early retirements
Yeah.
basically immediately when this thing kicks into effect, or actually between when it was sort of passed as law and when it kicked into effect. There's just like this massive wave of teacher retirements. You
Yeah.
can, you don't need any econometrics to see it. Basically, you just plot the time series of like what fraction of, retirement age teachers leave the system,
Yeah.
and you just see it in the time series. There's this massive spike. And so, if you look into the institutional details, you see that there were basically these massive financial incentives to retire before your district's collective bargaining agreement that was bargained under the old regime retired.
Yeah.
Because there was this concern that once you sort of severely weaken collective bargaining, that a lot of those benefits won't be there anymore.
Right.
And indeed, it turned out that a lot of those benefits, if you had waited, would not be there anymore if you'd waited.
Yeah.
And so there was just this rush of teachers that were leaving, the system at the onset of this union busting reform.
Yeah.
And so that you could see in the time series. And then I was sort of trying to figure out what did that do to students' outcomes. So,
Yeah.
if you were in a place where the fifth grade teacher used to be, this 56-year-old who now leaves, does that harm your test score?
Right.
And so then I started getting into all of these diff and diff things, comparing these places that had these retirement eligible teachers
Oh,
to places that didn't have these retirement eligible teachers.
yeah.
And so if I'm being honest, I ran a bunch of different specifications, and some of them had pre-trends and some of them didn't have pre-trends.
Right.
And I was kind of following, my advisor was like, all right, like this design seems to work. It doesn't have any pre-trends. Like, let's go with that one.
Right.
And so that's how I sort of started getting into the kind of diff and diff stuff
Mm-hmm.
of thinking about, I'm running all these diff and diffs. I'm going to select the ones where I don't find any statistically significant pre-trends. Is that an econometrically good thing to be doing or not?
Yeah.
And so
Right.
that's kind of how like my AR Insights paper basically came out of that exercise of
Right.
like, I was like running all these diff and diffs. I was trying to find the ones with good pre-trends. And then I started thinking about like, is this really how science is supposed to work?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
so that's kind of was my entree into actually doing econometrics research of like I was
Yeah.
working on this labor problem. Like I had this diff and diff, some of them worked, some of them didn't.
Yeah.
You know, the kind of what I thought was like the science at the time was like, look at the ones that work. But I
Yeah.
was like kind of uneasy of like, is that how the science should work? And so like, am I getting the
Right.
right thing? And so
Right.
that was kind of the genesis of my AR Insights paper.
Uh-huh.
And then like I kind of started working on this problem. I should say that so I guess I mainly had my foot in the labor door, but I was interested in econometrics or
Mm-hmm.
like methodological type of stuff. So I'd taken like Ariel Pecos's IO class, and he did a bunch of stuff on moment inequalities. And I was kind of interested in like I was asking him a bunch of technical questions. Again, having come from this background of like I could solve problems, right? Like I knew
Right.
how to do problem sets. I knew how to like, do you need these regularity conditions? Like what, properties of this estimator exist? So I took Ariel's class IO class where he did some moment inequality stuff, and I was asking him a bunch of econometrics questions about the moment inequality stuff.
Right.
And so that was in my second year. And so he had started working on this project that's now my restud paper with Ariel Pegas and Isaiah Andrews on moment inequalities.
Yeah.
And so I was asking all these questions about moment inequalities, and he was like, I'm like starting to work on this project with Isaiah, who at the time was a postdoc at Harvard, and was like,
Oh,
do you want to work as an RA on this project? And so I started working as an RA on that project, but it wasn't like my main area of interest. It was just like something I was kind of doing on the side. It seemed kind of interesting. Like Ariel
mhm.
was like a famous guy. To be honest, at the time, I didn't really know who Isaiah was, but I was
Yeah.
working on this project, started as an RA, eventually became a co-author with Ariel and Isaiah. And so I mentioned that because that means, so I had this connection to Isaiah,
Right.
right? Like I'd been working on as an RA and like later became a co-author on this project. And so I then was working on this diff and diff stuff and started coming on these questions about like, so should we be like selecting our designs based on whether the pre-trends look good or not? And so I like started writing some stuff up, and then like Isaiah was like, I don't know if he was a co-author yet at that time, but he was someone that I'd been like, working pretty closely with. And so I wrote some honestly really terrible notes. Like I like did not know how to write like econometrics papers at that point, but I wrote like some notes with some like ideas about kind of thinking about this problem.
Yeah.
And I sent them to Isaiah and was like, is this interesting from an econometrics perspective?
Right.
And Isaiah is like the greatest person in the world. So
Yeah.
he wrote back like, this seems like really good. And like, by the way, like all your proofs are wrong. And like, you should like, like, or not really wrong. Like this was not written up in the crispest way. And like, also you should like consider thinking about it from like this and this angle. But
Right.
so that's like kind of how I started going in econometrics. Like I was
Yeah.
working on labor econ stuff, but there were like these econometrics issues. I was like, as kind of a side project working as an RA on this like really technical like moment inequality stuff.
Hmm.
And that got me connected with Isaiah. And then like I started getting going on my own on this pre-testing stuff, and kind of was, sending it to Isaiah and getting good feedback. And that's like kind of how I got going. And then like I
Right.
really liked working on that project. Like, that project kind of spawned a bunch of other related projects. And then I
Yeah.
just kind of started going, like I got chugging with econometric stuff. Um, and then I liked doing it. And there was kind of like a moment of reckoning of like, I was planning to go on the market as like an applied micro person, but then I was working on all this metric stuff. And so there was a little bit of like an identity crisis in like my fourth
Mm.
year of like, which type of student am I? Like, can I go on the market? And I think like, I'm not that old. Like I was on the market 3 years ago, right?
Right.
But like, I do think that like, so like when I was thinking about going on the market, like, say 2 years before I was on the market, so we're talking 5 years ago, there was definitely much less of a applied econometrics sector, so to speak, than there was
Right.
now. Like my
Mhm.
advisors told me you can go on the market as econometrics, but there's got to be like some serious theory and proofs there. You
Yeah.
can like I was basically told like applied econometrics is like a place to die on the job market.
Oh,
And so there was like kind of this like moment of reckoning of like, like I thought like you just had to write a good job market paper. But
right.
then it got into these things of like, well, you can't really write a good job market paper and apply econometrics because like the applied people are like, I would love for the econometricians to hire this guy, and the metrics people would be like, well, I'd love for the applied guys to hire this guy. So you
Got it.
like, and the kind of advice I got, which I think, I mean, it was definitely very good advice at the time, but is like, I think to some extent, unfortunately, is still true now, is that when you're on the job market, you have to have some group that's very excited about you that goes to the meeting and they're like, we gotta hire this guy. Like this is
Yeah.
like such a fantastic opportunity. Like, I mean, I
Right.
think, like I serve on the hiring committee at Brown. So like that's definitely true. Like you have to have a coalition that's very excited about you.
Yeah. Right.
Um, and so there was a little bit of this moment of reckoning of like, am I gonna go econometrics or am I gonna go like the applied route?
Right.
And so like in my fourth year, I I was still kind of thinking like I'd written what became my AR Insights paper.
Mm.
That was like an econometrics project. And then I working on like I have this paper that Ashish and I published in computer science proceedings on like algorithmic fairness stuff.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of working on that with Ashish. And I was sort of thinking I was gonna go the like technical applied guy route. And like we had some of this like we had some of this algorithmic fairness, like applied theory type of stuff. And I was gonna get some data and like show that like our theory was right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like started like applying to some data sets. Like there was some bank that Sendel Mulanathan connected with me that had some like lending data that I could use. So I like kind of submitted that like application for this data. And then I was like waiting on the data to come. And like I'm honestly super thankful that this bank wound up being like really flaky and like didn't come through with this DUA for like a long time, because like in the meantime I was like, oh, like, you know, I can work on this econometric stuff while I'm waiting for like data to come through. And
Oh,
so like Ashish and I had been working on our algorithmic fairness stuff. And then we like were talking about like my pre-testing paper and like how can you do it better. And that was kind of like the genesis for our like a more credible approach to parallel trends,
yeah.
you know, paper, which wound up being my job market paper. So I was like basically like kind of waiting for data to come through. I was like gonna like, you know, kind of in this in-between space. Am I an econometrician? Am I an applied person? And then like Ashish and I started talking while I was waiting for this data to come through. And so I started working on this like a little bit more hardcore econometrics project, which
Yeah.
has like, you know, some more hardcore stuff in it. And then I liked working on that project. And so like I'd kind of been like, all right, like I'm gonna like try and see if like, you know, some more applied stuff works out. And then like I wound up working on more hardcore econometric stuff.
Yeah.
And that kind of just convinced me that like this seems to be what I'm gravitating towards. And
Yeah.
so like I decided, you know what, like fuck it, like maybe I'm like on the applied end of econometrics, but I'm
Right.
just like gonna go the econometrics route. And like ex post, that definitely wound up being the right decision for me.
Yeah.
And then kind of I think like the unexpected blessing was like I was working on all this diff and diff stuff, which like at the time was like I think just like a dead area of research. Like when I first sent Larry Katz like a draft of my pre-testing paper, he was like, this sounds really interesting, but like does anyone still work on diff and diff these days? You know, like it
Right.
was like Athey and InBend's 2006 like changes and changes model. And then like almost no like, you know, top publications on diff and diff stuff. Like there was a little bit small number of clusters, but like
Right.
really not a lot.
Right.
And then like all this like staggered treatment timing stuff, which was like, you know, on diff and diff, but from a very different angle from what I was doing.
Yeah.
Like kind of took off at the same time. And then I guess, you know, even beyond that, just like I think like applied econometrics just like kind of took off, I think,
Mm.
you know, around that time, just like more and more people doing it. And I think, you know, so
Can you real
I think,
quick, John, can you sort of for the sake of the listener that sort of can't follow the nuances, when is it that you're saying like within the community of a pure econometrician, this idea of them doing the applied work is historically not as common as it is right now? Is that what you're saying?
so I think I'm saying a couple of things. So, I mean, I think, you know, up until about say 5 years ago, so like the decade between 15 years ago and 5 years ago,
Yeah.
let's say, I think the econometrics community became more and more theoretical and in
Mm.
some sense a little bit kind of separated, let's say, from applied work,
Yeah.
right? So like applied, and I think, you know, as someone who lives a little bit kind of between the communities of applied people, like I kind of understand this from both sides. So I think from like the econometric side, you know, they did a lot of work on like partial identification, like moment inequalities. They did a lot of work on like weak identification and nonlinear models and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the adoption in applied work was relatively low. So I
Right.
think, you know, from the econometric side, they're like, oh, like, you know, we're developing all these tools, weak identification, you know, like Anderson Rubin, all these new, I guess Anderson Rubin's not new, but like all these new types of tools and methods, nonlinear models, and no one's using them.
Right.
Right. And so kind of the people who appreciate my stuff is other econometricians. And so the
Right.
community kind of became insular.
Yeah.
But then when you have an insular community, you write papers for the insular community. And so I think that had kind of a snowball effect where like the econometrics papers were written for econometrics referees. They
Yeah.
became very technical papers that in turn made them very hard to penetrate for applied researchers.
Right.
And so that made kind of the gap even larger.
Right.
And so you had like this hardcore theory econometrics community, and then you had this applied community. It's like not super well connected to the econometrics community. But then that kind of meant that there were like all these applied problems on things like
Yeah.
diff or Bardic instruments or stuff that was like
Oh,
the econometrics community was not super plugged in
right.
to what was kind of going on in the applied worlds.
Yeah.
And then the applied worlds, like weren't necessarily so prone to think about these econometrics issues.
Huh.
I mean, that's kind of my sense. I
Yeah.
guess I can't say, like, was I reading a lot of papers in Econometrica in 2005? No, right. So I guess I was, I was like in grad school for kind of the tail end of this, but like that's kind of my perception of sort of knowing a
Yeah.
lot of these people on kind of both sides of the aisle, so to speak, between econometrics and applied work. And so I think there was a little bit of this gap between like, hardcore econometrics theory and like applied work,
Yeah.
where like there were actually really important questions about stuff like diff and diff or Bardic instruments or stuff like that,
Yeah.
that I think over the last 5 or 6 years have started to get filled in with like more people in that space. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like people like me, or you know like Clément, Shays Martin, Xavier Dotfoy from the like metric side, and then also like the like theory and like the techie end of the applied people. I mean, I don't think these distinctions are like
Yeah.
super useful, but there are people like myself who went on the market as econometrics, and then there are people like Peter Hall or Pat Klein who went on the market as like labor economists, but do like techie,
Yeah.
applied econometrics stuff, who like we're probably closer to each other in like
Yeah.
kind of the space of things that we do, but like went on the markets in different fields, which
Right.
I think is just like testament to the kind of bifurcation of that market, right? Like you're like either hardcore econometrics or you're like an applied person. And I think like, Peter, who's my colleague and friend, and I like both kind of discussed how like we had this identity crisis going on the market. Like, what we do was not really considered a field, at least at that time. And so, kind of he went from the really techie end of labor and I went from the really applied end of metrics. But I think now that space is starting to get more people in it.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping, I think now it's hopefully easier to be on the market as say like a metrics person with a, more applied paper.
Yeah.
And I think actually I would say, I was warned that like applied econometrics isn't really a field. And like, it's true, someone has to get excited about you. But then when I was on the market at a lot of places, I mean, there's of course a selection bias of which places flew me out, right? But like the
Mhm.
places that flew me out, I just felt like there was just like a ton of pent up demand
Right.
of like, people who are like, we would love to have an econometrician who we can talk to about
Right.
like our diff and diffs.
Right.
And we just like don't see a lot of people in this space, but we would like love to have, someone like you around that's both plugged into the econometrics group, but is also, working on these applied problems and will
Yeah.
like, advise students, help faculty, et cetera, in that space. So I think one of the things I've been really happy to see over the last 5 or 6 years is just like more and more places hiring people in that space. And then that in turn kind of, lets people feel like, they're not going to be unemployed if they kind of write theses in this space and go on the market in this space. So I think that's kind of both my journey, but I think also the journey of a bunch of other people kind of that are now filling in this space of applied econometrics stuff,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
has been really exciting. Yeah.
You think that was partly because of the impact of these IV papers like Bardic, like Paul Goldsmith Pinkham and Kirill and Peter's work on shift share, and then all these diff and diff econometricians? You think that's where all of a sudden there's this like this closer conversation between the econometrics community and the applied community, or did you think it was already happening before that? Those are the two touchstones that I kind of noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to take too much credit that like, my literature, the diff and diff literature, like just brought about this fantastic
Right,
change in
that's
the
right.
world.
Right.
But
The healing power. Yeah.
it was specifically, Roth 2022 and Roth and Robinson 2023 that like, so I mean, I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, but those are like, I think definitely like two of the most prominent examples of like stuff going on like
Yeah.
in this applied space.
Right.
I think like, maybe some of the synthetic control I would also put in that stuff, right? So like, you know, Alberto's work and
Mm-hmm.
all the stuff that came after that, like the stuff by like Avi Feller and co-authors and stuff on like,
Yeah.
practical issues with synthetic control, I think I would put in there as well. And then, maybe from the more applied side, like, there was like a lot of stuff on like teacher value added and
Yeah.
like, base shrinkage and stuff like that. That was also
Right.
kind of in this space.
Yeah.
So I don't think it wasn't exclusively the diff and diff people, but I think that definitely, furthered things along or at least was like, sort of one of the like key examples of an area that kind of got filled in this space that, people are like, oh, like people are doing diff and diff for so long. Why is it there's all of a sudden like a million papers on this topic?
Right.
And I think,
Right.
like, I think that kind of, is a, example of this thing where like there weren't a lot of people that were just like working in this like applied econometric space for, span of several years.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, I didn't really think about that, but having this mass of econometricians in a particular topic is probably the like agglomeration effects of that kind of thing is going to cause like an explosion of insight. And there's so many people in diff and diff now working. I'm sure it's just been like so productive for just deepening everybody's understanding of what the heck that is. I mean, it's such like I hadn't really thought, it's like you could imagine a tipping point kind of does happen when there's just a lot of people that start working on it. All of a sudden it's not just that a lot of people are working on it, is that you have all these different ways of collaborating when you've collaborated with a bunch of people on this stuff. Yeah. Well, let me ask you something. So this kind of is top of the hour. So I wanted to sort of kind of end with this, like you kind of like a dear John Roth kind of question. So, there's a lot of young people, there's a lot of young economists, and there's a lot of data scientists that are kind of looking to make a impact in their fields. And, because you've been out for 3 years and because you've, have sort of had a big impact already, you probably have a real good, sense of vision of like what the world's like right now and what you sort of see going. So I was just kind of like wondering, I mean, for somebody out there who's very young in their area, who's in a has maybe some desire to do applied work or econometrics or whatever, even in industry, because you were at Microsoft for a while. So what kind of advice would you give those people looking to have make a difference in their fields?
Yeah, good question. So, I guess I've gotten versions of this questions from graduate students for sure. And the kind of usual advice I give is just work on what you think is interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess people always have this, approach of like, what do you think will work well in the job market?
Right.
Is this going to be a good job market paper? And I certainly had this attitude, as I mentioned, like I had all these misgivings. Am I an econometrician? Am I an applied person? And I guess my kind of, with hindsight, my view is that it's just so hard to predict what the market is going to want.
Right.
When I started working on this pre-testing stuff in like, I don't know, 2016, I had like zero way of foreseeing that there would be like a diff and diff revolution or whatever. Right. It's, like the fact that became like a hot thing was just so far off the horizon. And so, you could work on diff and diff now, and there's a lot of interest in it now, but like, can I promise you that there's going to be so much interest in diff and diff in 5 years? Not really. So I think, in some sense, I think it's hard to predict what the market is going to want.
Right.
And then I think even if you can predict what the market is going to want, then it's, you know, it's not obvious that it's the best thing for you to do what you think the market is going to want.
Yeah.
Just because it's really hard to work on stuff that you're not passionate about.
Right.
And I think this is especially true in academia.
Yeah.
You and I kind of take a pay cut relative to what we could earn elsewhere for being in academia, because it has like this awesome perk to it that we can work on the stuff that we think is interesting.
Right.
And so I think especially for people like in PhD programs, to me, it's sort of like, if you're gonna let the market determine what it is that you want to work on and work on something that you're not really interested in, then like you're taking the pay cut but not getting the compensating differential. Right. So like, if you want to work on what the market values, like go work for Amazon or Microsoft or Uber or something. I mean, like, you're gonna make a lot more money and like, probably work better, or definitely not worse hours, working on what kind of the market thinks is an interesting problem.
Yeah.
So to me, like, the perk of being in academia is like you get to work on what you want.
Right.
And so if you're going to be in academia, you should work on something you find interesting.
Right.
And then even from like a just pure like maximizing success, I at least find that the publication process in econ takes so long,
right,
that by the time my paper is published, I am so friggin' tired of that paper. Like, I never want to touch it again.
Yeah.
Right. And that's with projects that like I've basically told myself, like, I'm only going to work on projects I find interesting.
Right.
So, the first 6 months of the project are really interesting. Like getting out a draft, getting feedback on it is kind of interesting. Like presenting it is interesting for the first few times. Then like you get kind of bored. Then eventually like the paper gets an R&R. At that point, you're like so tired of this paper. Then like you submit it, you maybe get a second round or a conditional accept. At that point, you like never want to see this paper again. And then like by the time it's published, like you really like, I would rather watch paint dry than like think about this paper again.
Yeah.
And so that's with like, I was really interested in this project at the beginning. And so it's just like very hard for me to imagine like going through all that process if even at the beginning you're not interested in this project.
Right.
And so I think my advice for grad students or like young people is just kind of follow what you're interested in, because it's very hard to predict what the market's going to like, especially in academia. Like the benefit of academia is you can work on what you want.
Right.
And also it's very hard to successfully innovate on stuff that you're not interested in.
Totally.
And so if you're in any kind of creative field, like you kind of got to just work on the stuff that you think you're interested in, because that's the kind of stuff where you're going to be thinking about it in the shower and be thinking about it when you're going on a walk. And like, that's kind of when inspiration strikes.
Right.
So I think that just kind of like, for all of these reasons, like my advice is just, work on problems that you think are important and that you think are interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. Well, man, this has been so much fun. I feel like we've only just chatted on the internet. And so it's really nice to hang out and get to hear more of your story. Can you say, for the sake of the listener though, about the workshop that you're going to be doing and what that's going to be about and when that is?
Yeah. So I'm going to do, this is the second. I did one of these last year. I think it's called an Advanced Diff and Diff Workshop. So it'll be a 1-day thing, kind of start up with the canonical difference and differences model, what I think people understood pretty well, 5 or 10 years ago. Basically what I teach to my undergrads, 2 periods, treatment in the second period, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
And then kind of talk about, I guess, 2 strands of relaxations of that model. So I'll start in the morning with recent stuff about staggered treatment timing. So instead of 2 periods, you have multiple periods. Some of the treatments, some units get treated in 2011, some get treated in 2012, and so on. and kind of the complications that arise when we get to that model and the recent innovations that have happened in that literature. And then I'll talk about stuff more closely related to most of my own work on difference and differences, which is about, well, we often don't know about parallel trends and how effectively can we test for it, and how can we kind of accommodate certain violations of parallel trends and stuff like that. So those will kind of be the two main sections of the class once we go through the basic model. And then for each of those sections, I both give kind of lectures on the theory, but I also try and make it really practical. So each of those, we kind of do the lecture, and then after each one, there's a coding exercise.
Yeah.
So I have this nice example with kind of how does health insurance coverage change when states expand Medicaid? And so that has some elements of the staggered treatment timing, but also some elements of, we might worry that, the Democratic leaning states that expanded are different from the Republican leaning states that didn't expand. And so how do we think about, potential violations and parallel trends in that context?
Yeah.
And so you'll kind of get a chance to not just learn about it in theory, but also open up our data and code these things up.
Yeah. Since you've been at Microsoft, would you say that this is the kind of workshop that you could imagine people in tech would be interested in? And if you could just if you had to explain, if you were talking to somebody in tech and you would say, this is why I think it would be useful, what would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah. So I mean, I think, obviously useful for academics, but I think also useful for people in tech. At least when I was at Microsoft, they could randomize certain things, but there were also a lot of things that they couldn't randomize. And so there were a lot of, diff and diff or synthetic control type of applications around, we introduced this product in, the Northeast of the United States, and we didn't in the Northwest or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's been, a lot of innovation recently in tools for doing that. And so I do think for sure, for people in tech using these types of quasi-experimental methods, this could be super useful as well.
Cool. Well, man, it's so nice to hang out. And I'll put in the podcast on the Substack a link to the workshop. But it's really great to see you, and really enjoyed our talk.
Yeah, this is really fun. Let's do it again some other time.
Okay,
that'd be great.
All right, cool.
All right, thanks, Scott.
See you, man.
Right, bye.
Gonna see us through. Honey, you need me. Baby, I need you.